The heat was oppressive, the kind of dry, suffocating heat you only get in places like this, an Afghan desert valley, somewhere between the blistering sun and the ever-present dust. We'd been here less than a month, but I'd already learned that the desert could strip you down faster than any enemy could. Water was our lifeline, and I had to keep reminding the squad to hydrate. It was almost as if the guys thought they were invincible, but even the toughest need a break from the sun. As the rookie in the squad, I knew my place. Not much of one, really. The others barely paid me any attention, tossing jokes and scoffs in my direction when I mentioned staying hydrated, but at least they listened. We crossed into the village, about a mile from our combat outpost, COP, and the Hearts and Minds operation kicked off. Standard stuff. Really, treat the locals well, hand out some candy, make them think we're here to help. My buddy, a PFC from Wyoming, pulled out a shiny, wrappered American candy bar. He handed it to a little girl without a second thought. She took it without hesitation, but before we could even blink, an older man barged in, shoving my buddy away, shouting in that sharp, guttural language we'd been trying to learn. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The squad converged, rifles raised, fingers twitching over triggers. But the guy didn't back down. He'd just violated some sacred rule of their culture. The man didn't give a damn about our guns. He was looking for justice, his way. He grabbed the little girl by the hair, yanking her back into a stone hut. The candy bar dropped into the sand, untouched. Adrenaline surged, but the tension fizzled out as quickly as it had arrived. I thought we'd have to smoke that guy, my buddy muttered, turning away. He's lucky, someone else added. We were still fresh on this deployment, and the weight of the local customs hadn't really hit us until we saw it up close. Next time, just eat your own candy, I joked, giving him a playful tap on his vest. Before anyone could respond, a massive explosion erupted in the distance. My stomach flipped as a thick cloud of smoke shot up into the air. I squinted against the sun, trying to make sense of the mess. Something inside me was almost hypnotized by it. The chaos, the violence. It was like watching a show, but it wasn't. We hadn't been in combat yet, and this was what I thought it might feel like. Then the realization hit. Oh, fuck. That's where Alpha's operating, our platoon sergeant said, his voice tight. My pulse sped up. Anything on the radio? I asked, but he just waved us off and grabbed the radio bearer, trying to tune into Alpha's frequency. Static, nothing. Shit, he muttered, slamming the receiver back down. LT. Orders? The lieutenant was already on the comms with battalion, trying to figure out what the hell had gone wrong. Meanwhile, the locals, those who hadn't already ducked for cover, were doing just that. The explosion had been huge, the ground had shaken beneath us, but there was no telling what had happened out there. Was Alpha okay? Were there casualties? We stood there, tense, eyes locked on the horizon. A few villagers started poking their heads out, murmuring in their native tongue. That's when my buddy lost it. He stormed up to the man who had shoved him earlier, rifle raised, jabbing it in the man's face. Think this shit is funny? He screamed. The villagers scattered, some trying to pull him off, but he shoved them away. I had no choice but to step in. Grabbing his rifle, I pulled it down. Dude, what the fuck? I snapped, my voice low but furious. Our platoon sergeant was there, dragging the guy aside. I couldn't hear what was said, but the anger in the sergeant's voice was unmistakable. Meanwhile, the locals, women and children were still inside, but the men were stepping out, armed and looking ready to fight. Oh, shit, someone muttered. We snapped into formation, weapons raised. That's when the LT sprinted up, hands raised, trying to calm the situation down, to show we weren't here to escalate things. But before we could de-escalate, another explosion rocked the ground. This one was followed by several smaller blasts. Rockets. The adrenaline spiked again. Alpha was in deep trouble. LT, what the hell do we do now? Our platoon sergeant shouted. Everyone form the fuck up on me now, he bellowed. The whole platoon quickly surrounded him, ready to move out. Alpha's been hit. We're the closest, about a mile out. We're hoofing it, boys. Keep your heads on a swivel, check your shots, and let's get them out, the LT shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. Hua, we all responded in unison. The other platoons were spread thin elsewhere, and as we'd come to realize over this deployment, it was always our job to have our buddies' backs. Doc, get over here, the LT barked. I rushed to him. Doc, when we get there, it's gonna be bad. I'm talking mass casualties. You good? His eyes locked onto mine. I was fresh, barely 19, new to this hell, and I could feel the weight of his stare. I nodded quickly. Yeah, I'm good, sir. But I knew he could see the tremble in my hands. Soldier, suck it up. We're gonna need you. Don't fuck this up, he snapped, staring me down like he was willing me to believe it. The march to the blast site was a blur. Gunfire echoed off in the distance, drawing closer as we neared. Anxiety crawled up my spine. What had we walked into? More explosions shattered the air, shaking our resolve. I ran through my training in my mind. Wound types, treatments, gear placement. I could feel the weight of my medic bag slung across my back, my fingers twitching at the straps. We finally hit the town's outskirts. The sounds of the firefight were clear now. Alpha had pushed through this town, despite Edie's warnings about the IED risk. There was a platoon in there, fighting tooth and nail against a mob of insurgents. We didn't know them well, but today, we were their lifeline. Get Alpha on the fucking radio, the LT yelled, and the radio operator scrambled to set up the antenna. We huddled in a cluster of small, one-bedroom houses, keeping our heads down. The firefight was somewhere to the northeast. The Bang Bang Squad, loaded with heavy weapons, machine guns, long-range rifles, rocket launchers, had taken position on a roof. They began scanning the empty streets, looking for an angle. Then, a shout rang out. I see tracers. Both ways. I think I got them. A sniper from his perch called out. The LT immediately darted over, trying to piece together the intel. Listen up, men. First rodeo, but it won't be the last. Remember your training, keep discipline, and we'll get through this shit together, the PSG said, his voice calm but steady. We all gripped our rifles harder, silently acknowledging the tension that crackled in the air. A few of them shot me sideways glances, as if praying I wouldn't freeze. I held their gaze, but didn't say a word. Finally, the plan was set. Alpha radioed back. 3 Kia, 4 critically wounded, and 3 more maimed, but still in the fight. Mass casualties, all right. Mortars were pounding their position. Our job was to flank the enemy, take out the mortars and machine gun nests, and carve a path to rescue the survivors. Simple enough, right? Except there was no air support, no artillery, no QRF to back us up. It was us or them. The Wild West had called us in. We moved through the town, keeping to alleys and hugging buildings for cover. The streets seemed so normal. Shops, homes, I even saw a bicycle abandoned on the ground. But the gunfire was getting louder, and we steeled ourselves. Our squad leader gave the command to bound forward across a street we thought was clear. But, of course, it wasn't. The blast hit us like a freight train. I was thrown into a wall, the force of the impact rattling my entire body. My vision blurred, and my hearing vanished. Something warm and wet dripped down my face. Where was I? What just happened? Someone grabbed me and yanked me upright, but I collapsed again, disoriented. They pulled me up a second time, but I couldn't hear their words. That face. I knew him. Why was he yelling? Then, slowly, my senses came back. The screams cut through the fog in my head. Doc, get the fuck over here, someone screamed, desperation raw in their voice. I stumbled forward, then froze. A soldier lay on the ground, his body twisted and lifeless. His face was a bloody mess, his eyes glazed over. I was back. An ID had gone off when one of our guys stepped on it, a small anti-personnel mine meant to maim, not kill, but today it had done both. I kneeled beside him, quickly assessing the situation. 1 Kia, no legs, pelvis destroyed, his face pulverized. 2 others on the ground, one screaming, clutching his face, the other unresponsive. The horror of it all hit me like a tidal wave, but I couldn't let it overwhelm me. I had a job to do. I rolled over to one of the injured soldiers and checked for a pulse. His abdomen and legs were a mess of debris and shrapnel, his pulse weak and thready. I wrapped the wounds as best as I could, making sure to pack what I could to stop the bleeding. No need for a tourniquet here, just the basics, and I saved my limited supplies for more critical wounds. Next, I moved to the soldier clutching his face. His head had slammed through a window when he was thrown into a wall. His arm dangled limply, most likely a dislocated shoulder from the blast. I slapped him a few times to try to rouse him, but he barely stirred. Morphine wasn't ideal, his pain was bad, but I needed him awake for assessment. When he finally blinked and muttered, "I can't fucking see. I can't fucking see," I knew things were worse than I thought. Glass shards were embedded in his face, somehow avoiding his eyes entirely. "You're fine. Shut the fuck up. You're fine," I yelled back as I carefully began removing the larger pieces. That's when I realized we were still under fire. My training kicked in autopilot mode. The adrenaline surged through me, drowning out the fear. Bullets zipped overhead, the sound of them breaking the sound barrier almost soothing in its familiarity. I stayed low, kept moving, focused on the task at hand. The rest of the team was recovering, returning fire as best they could. "Contact right," someone shouted, pointing down the street. 3 enemy fighters were peeking around the corner, firing at us. Our guys held them off as best they could. I finally stabilized my patient. "Do you need morphine?" I asked. He shook his head, his voice tight with pain. "I just need one fucking eye, doc. Get out of the way." With that, he stood, shoved me aside, and grabbed his rifle. "Get the fuck out of here, doc," he muttered as he bolted for the fight. I turned back to the fallen soldier, the one who hadn't made it. His body was mangled, unrecognizable. I stood there, frozen, staring at him. I didn't know his name, not well anyway. But I knew he was in my squad. And now, he was gone. His story had ended too soon, but there was nothing I could do. I felt my legs weaken, my vision blurring again. Panic set in. I had to focus, had to keep moving. "Doc, we need to go." "Now," my squad leader shouted, snapping me out of my stupor. I nodded and grabbed my rifle, my first time actually engaging in the fight. I carried the fallen soldier's body to a nearby house, laying him gently on the floor. We'd come back for him later. Right now, we had to reconnect with the rest of the platoon, who were also taking heavy fire. "What's the fucking plan?" someone screamed. "Shoot the fucking bad guys," came the sarcastic reply. "No shit, what the fuck are we doing?" came the next yell. We got ourselves together. "The enemy's in that building. Get the AT," barked the PSG. The AT was an anti-tank rocket, but it was perfect for demolishing enemy strongholds. A soldier from Bang Bang squad sprinted up with the launcher on his shoulder. "Where at?" he shouted, sighting in. The PSG pointed and the soldier nodded. "Back last area clear," he yelled. We checked the area and confirmed. Then he fired, sending a 15-pound rocket into the building with a deafening explosion. A few M203 grenades followed, raining down on the same spot. The gunfire from the building stopped as the walls collapsed and the roof came down. We moved forward cautiously, sweeping the area for hostiles. As we neared the wreckage, I noticed bodies in the rubble. I didn't know how to feel. How could you react when everything you'd just seen seemed like a nightmare? I looked up to see my squad leader waving me over. "Doc, move your ass," he shouted. I hurried to catch up as we bounded across the street, the chaos still all around us. Then I saw it. Time seemed to slow. I caught sight of my squad leader running ahead, when suddenly, a man in front of him lunged at him. His torso was heavy with something wrapped around him. I blinked, trying to process what was happening. Suicide vest. Before I could react, someone grabbed the man, yanked him off my squad leader, and threw him to the ground. A bullet tore through the man's head, his brain matter splattering the ground. "Fuck! Fuck!" screamed my squad leader, his voice tight with panic. "Motherfucker almost got us." His face twisted in a mix of anger and relief. We kept moving, but the fire kept coming, bullets now hissing by us like angry wasps. We finally reached the buildings where a co was holed up. Their Humvees were battered, and none of their guns were returning fire. "Let's go." "Right there," the PSG yelled, pointing to a building across the way. I squinted through the haze and saw 2 machine guns pointing directly at a co's position. "Bang bang, go left," barked the PSG. "Lifeline, to the right." "That's us." They'd named our squad Lifeline because I was the medic. I had suggested 911 squad, but September 11th and all. Killer and Devil with me. Our squad had nicknames for everything. We broke off, heading in our assigned direction. The rest of the journey felt like an eternity. Normally, it would have taken 5 minutes to reach the building. That day, every second felt like an hour, every step a battle. Thankfully, the resistance wasn't too heavy along our path. We neared the building when the door beside us exploded open. The force of it cracked one of the soldiers in the helmet, sending him stumbling. An enemy combatant burst out, a knife in his hand, tackling the soldier ahead of me. "Knife!" I yelled, grabbing the attacker. He kicked the downed soldier in the face, breaking his nose. As I pulled the enemy up, he jabbed his knife into my sappy plate. The impact knocked me backward onto my rear, but before I could react, the soldier behind me pistol-whipped the attacker with his rifle, smashing his face in before putting 2 rounds in his chest. This was war. It didn't faze me as much as it should have. But inside, I was still in chaos, heart racing, skin clammy. War wasn't where I wanted to be, but here I was, and I had no choice but to keep going. We helped the injured soldier up, and I assessed his nose, which had taken a hard hit from the door. "Fuck me, that's broken, man," I muttered as I worked to slow the bleeding. "Can you see?" barked my squad leader. The soldier nodded, giving a thumbs up despite the mess his face had become. I chuckled under my breath, "Tough son of a bitch." His face was bruising blue and purple, but he was grinning with bloody lips. I slapped him on the back, giving him a quick, bro hug, then joined the others to regroup. We waited for the signal to storm the stronghold, each squad positioned around it. Grenades went off, followed by more explosions from within, and the screams of the enemy as we stormed the door to clear it. I was the last one in this time, waiting outside until the all clear came. "All clear," someone yelled after a few gunfights from within. I ran inside, adrenaline pumping. "Now what, Sarge?" I shouted over the chaos. "Radio," the PSG shouted back. Minutes of frantic shouting into the handset passed before we finally got confirmation that the enemy was retreating further into the town. We had won the battle, but the war was far from over. I sprinted to where our guys were, treating injuries as fast as my battle-worn legs would take me. When I reached a man I didn't know, I saw his patch. The medic. My stomach dropped. Kneeling beside him, I gently placed his hands over his chest, trembling. "Fuck," I whispered. A grenade had shredded his jugular and upper torso. He'd died within seconds, just like that. He was a good fucking guy, someone muttered behind me. I turned to see an ACO sergeant approaching, his Arkansas drawl thick. "I don't know him," I said quietly. "Never seen you around here, kid." "Where you from?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Bravo, sir." "Second platoon," I replied. He let out a low whistle. "Fuck me runnin'? What are you, 12 years old?" "Goddamn, they send young these days." I smirked. 19, sir. First deployment. First combat, actually. He raised an eyebrow and lit a cigarette, offering it to me. I declined. "Fuck, newbie, huh? You're alright, kid. Thanks for what you did for my boys." Our doc was a good dude. Funny and bravest motherfucker I ever met. He paused, pulling a drag from his cigarette. "You scared?" he asked finally. "Yeah, I'm fucking terrified, Sergeant," I admitted, ashamed. He nodded, smoke curling from his mouth. "Good. That'll keep you alive out here. Just don't let it get to you. You're their medic. You gotta run through hell to get home." I just nodded. "Doc, get over here," someone shouted from down the hallway. I nodded to the sergeant and ran toward the voice. "Doc, case vac is on the way." "You good?" my squad leader asked, his tone more concerned than usual. I swallowed dryly. feeling the pain set in. Hi, why yeah, I'm good, I stammered, trying to ignore the bleeding cheek, the contusions across my body, and the cut on my forehead. He put a hand on my shoulder. You did good today, document. You're not new anymore. Good shit. Keep that up and we'll get home. I smiled weakly, nodding. Thanks, Sergeant. Today fucking sucked. He laughed, a tired chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maybe it was from exhaustion, or maybe he was just trying to avoid breaking down. We ain't been in the shit yet, document. I smiled again, nodding. Eventually, I found myself loading the dead and wounded onto the caseback, climbing aboard with the worst of them. We made it out just in time for dinner. As I sat there, I laughed quietly to myself, assisted by another medic who patched up my face. A thumbs up, and I was good to go. Our first real combat operation in the valley, in the so-called heart of darkness, hadn't gone well. At least, that's how I saw it. We were hailed as lifesavers, praised for our bravery, but the image of that fallen medic haunted me. That could have been me. It could still be me. Was I truly ready for this? I didn't know what the next 11 months would bring, and I wasn't sure I was prepared. But what made me ready was the bond I'd built with my guys. Laughing with them, joking around in the midst of hell, that was what would keep me going. We lost a few good men that day, and I still grieve for them. Even when it's out of your hands, the pain lingers. But I made it out of hell that day, facing my demons head-on. As a side note, this town would haunt us until the day we left. It was the same place that supplied the Taliban, the same place that would eventually take my friend Mina from me, in my story, a girl and her dog. No matter how hard we tried, we could never fully secure it. The days bled together in the valley. The constant roar of the wind, the dust choking the air, and the unease that hung over us like a dark cloud, this place didn't give up its secrets easily. We spent weeks moving through the streets, searching for the enemy, clearing buildings, but the enemy was always one step ahead. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like the valley was a living thing, shifting and twisting, always ready to swallow us whole. Every operation felt like a game of roulette. We were lucky to have made it this far, and the realization gnawed at me, hollowing out what was left of my optimism. The men, though, they held up better than I expected. They had become more than just a unit. They were family now. They had my back, I had theirs. But that bond, that trust, only made it harder to see the faces of the fallen, to carry the weight of their absence. Every life lost was a piece of me I'd never get back. That night, we sat around the fire, passing around a bottle of whiskey someone had scavenged. The stars above were bright, clear despite the chaos of the days. It was a brief escape, and the laughter, though hollow, was a relief. I don't even know what day it is anymore, one of the guys said, tipping his bottle toward the sky. It's all just one big blur. It's Wednesday, I said, not looking up from my rifle. At least, I think it is. They chuckled, but the mood was still heavy. There was a long pause before one of the others spoke. I keep seeing it, he said, voice quiet. The faces, the ones we couldn't save, the ones who didn't make it out. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. We had all been carrying that weight, but it was different when someone else spoke it aloud. It made it real in a way that was impossible to ignore. You're not alone in that, I said, my voice tight. None of us are. We all carry it. The trick is, we don't let it break us. You really believe that? Someone asked. Not sure, I admitted. But what else do we have? There was silence, and for a moment, it felt like the war had paused, like we were just a group of soldiers sharing a drink after a hard day. But I knew it wouldn't last. The next operation was always just around the corner. And with it, the reminder that nothing was ever truly certain. We didn't talk about it much after that. We didn't need to. The war had a way of silencing the things that needed to be said, leaving us all with the bitter knowledge that our lives weren't our own anymore. Every day was about survival, and every action was weighed against that truth. It wasn't until a week later that we had our next taste of the valley's fury. The intel came in the form of a whisper. Enemy combatants spotted moving through a cluster of homes on the far side of the valley. We geared up quickly, moving out in the early hours of the morning. The sun hadn't even risen, but the world felt heavy, pregnant with tension. As we moved through the narrow streets, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about this felt wrong. The silence was too thick, too unnatural. Even the birds, which usually greeted the morning with their incessant chatter, had fallen silent. "Eyes up," the squad leader ordered, his voice low and alert. We had to stay sharp. This was what they trained us for. The rumors about ambushes in this region, hell, we had seen them before, came flooding back. Every corner was a potential death trap, every window a sniper's perch. We moved through the town like ghosts, silent but always aware of the danger lurking just out of sight. Then, as we rounded the corner of a small alley, it happened. The first shot rang out, deafening in the stillness. It whizzed past my ear, too close for comfort. Instinctively, I dropped to the ground, my rifle coming up in a fluid motion. The rest of the squad hit the dirt with practiced precision, returning fire in the general direction of the shot. The firefight erupted into chaos. I could hear the crack of enemy rifles, the unmistakable roar of an RPG being launched. I ducked behind a corner, my heart hammering in my chest. Adrenaline kicked in, but there was a part of me, a small part, that couldn't believe it was happening again. That it was happening now. "Doc." I heard someone shout. "We need a medic." I turned and saw one of the guys, his arm hanging limply at his side, blood seeping through his combat shirt. He was clutching his shoulder, face pale with pain. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled over to him, dropping to my knees and assessing the damage. His shoulder was shattered, blood pouring from the wound. "Hang in there, buddy. I'm gonna fix this," I muttered as I worked to stop the bleeding, my hands shaking despite my best efforts. "Doc, it hurts like a bitch," he said, his voice strained. I knew the pain he was feeling, but I didn't have the time to comfort him. "Stay with me," I snapped, applying a pressure bandage to the wound. The battle raged around us, but in that moment, it was just me and him, fighting to keep him alive. As I finished securing the bandage, a loud explosion sent shockwaves through the street. The world seemed to tilt, and I lost my balance, falling to my side. My head slammed against the ground, and for a second, the world went black. When I came to, I was on my back, staring up at the sky. Dust and debris hung in the air, swirling around like smoke. My ears rang from the blast. I shook my head, trying to clear the haze, but it didn't help. I was disoriented. The sounds of battle had dulled, but they were still there. Faint gunfire in the distance. The occasional shout. I sat up, my head spinning. My first instinct was to check on my guys. I turned to see my squad leader pulling the injured soldier to cover, dragging him out of the line of fire. "Doc, get up. We're not done yet," the squad leader yelled, his voice cutting through the haze. I shook my head again, steadying myself. "I'm good," I shouted back, forcing my body into motion. Adrenaline surged through me, clearing the fog in my mind. I wasn't about to go down now. I grabbed my rifle, adjusting it against my body as I moved forward, ducking behind cover. I knew we had to press forward. We couldn't let up. We moved cautiously through the town, clearing rooms and streets, each step heavier than the last. With every building we cleared, the weight of the dead and wounded grew. It was as if the valley was a constant reminder that war never gave up. And neither would we.